This is the Symposium on Technology and Future of Workers in the Global South. This session is being organized by Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, Wits University, Johannesburg, and Centre for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. The moderator for this session is Professor Ravi Srivastava. He's Professor and Director, Centre for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. A warm welcome to you, sir. The presenters in this session would be made by Professor Sunil Mani. He's Director, Centre for Development Studies, Trivandrum. Dr. Uma Rani, she's Senior Economist, International Labour Organization, Geneva. Dr. Selim Raihan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Dhaka. Dr. Milene Serene, she's from University of Utrecht. And Dr. Ruth Castle-Branco and Dr. David Francis from Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. The discussers in this session are Dr. Imran Valodia. He's Director, Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and Dr. Gayatri Nair. She's Assistant Professor in the President Institute of Information Technology, Delhi. I request Professor Srivastava to please conduct the session.
Thank you, Priyanka. And we are beginning this session, this panel session, Technological Change and the Future of Work. In a sense, this is one of the most important questions which is facing us today, and on which we need a great deal more research than is happening currently. And it is to the credit of the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies in Wits University, Johannesburg, that they are grounding global studies in the area, global South studies in the area. This is the second phase, and I hope Imran gets the time to say a little more about it, in which they have launched a number of studies by scholars from a large number of countries. IHD has been in partnership with the Southern Centre of Inequality Studies. So we are very grateful to the Southern Centre for sponsoring this panel and for IHD for partnering it and bringing it to the conference. As all of you know, the fourth industrial revolution, which is characterized by the digital revolution, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, and the platform economy, are considered to be transforming the employment scenario globally. Also employment relations and the labor process in very fundamental ways. The fourth industrial revolution is considered to be moving forward at a rate faster than earlier industrial revolutions. The rate of diffusion of new technologies is generally quite slow across the globe, but this is considered to be at a rate faster than others. It is fundamentally changing the landscape of capital, both globally and nationally. It is creating new scale economies, particularly that of information. It is blurring the distinction and the boundaries between knowledge capital and physical capital. It is creating growing inequality between categories of capital, between capital and labor, and between workers. While creating greater flexibility for workers, it is also creating new forms of precariousness, and the degree and nature of control that capital is able to exercise over labor has been now increased to a new level. As in all such changes, it is creating winners and losers, the losers are generally workers in the lower swaths of the work and knowledge pyramid. What are the implications of all this for employment generation, workers' right, and equitable growth in countries in the global south, which straddle the pre-industrial and all stages of the industrial revolution? These are the kinds of questions which demand urgent attention, which is why we are particularly grateful to the Southern Centre of Inequality Studies for sponsoring this panel and for ISLE for hosting it. Over the next few presentations, we will hear scholars presenting global and national perspectives around the many issues surrounding the technological change and future of work in the global south. Dr. Sunil Mani, he is the director of the Centre for Development Studies in Trivandrum. He has been working in manufacturing and technological change for a long time and has been focusing for a number of years on a specific kind of technological change, which is robotics. I'll request him to come in next, but I'll also request all the speakers to please do the time management themselves also, so that we can finish in time.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ravi Srivastava. Thank you also to the Indian Society of Labour Economics for giving me a chance to speak here. I am actually going to speak on impact of advanced manufacturing technologies on manufacturing employment in India. And I'm taking the specific case of multi-purpose industrial robots, because as you know, this is one of the technologies which forms a basket of technologies which is subsumed under the Industry 4.0 kind of technologies. Now, I will first talk about the motivation for this doing this kind of a work in general, and I will talk about the significance of the research problem, the specific research question that I'm asking, and the methodology and data sources. This is important because I'm using a very unique data source for measuring the diffusion of multi-purpose industrial robots in manufacturing. I have a brief engagement with the literature on, the diffusion of robots and their effect on employment. And then I provide some descriptive data for the world as a whole, and then I come specifically to the Indian case. Okay. So let me start with the motivation in general, because these days we have a discussion which started from after the publication of a very important paper way back in 2013 by two authors from Oxford. The basic argument is that robots are coming and people are now going to lose employment. And robots are becoming cheaper and they are becoming more smarter. And as they go, their use in manufacturing, even in small and medium enterprises, will result in a large-scale unemployment. And already many countries, especially countries like India, has already been going through a process of employment loss. And we have had this discussion, especially after the economic liberalization of 1991. Okay. Although the empirical research on this is largely confined to the US, but what you find is that there are two things which are coming. One is there is a very poor wage growth, and there is also inequalities increasing between those who are highly skilled and those who are low skilled. And automation is likely to accentuate this process of inequality in wages in the years to come. Now, some recent research using data on robots have actually shown that increase in robot density, will not actually reduce employment that much. Okay, and there are of course studies which says just exactly the opposite of this as well. But what is interesting is to see is that robot prices have actually been plummeting over the years because of technological innovations in the robot manufacturing industry, and there are, and as I said, complete robotic systems are now well within the reach of even small and medium enterprises. At the same time, you find labor costs are actually increasing. So it becomes very right for robots to be used as a kind of an automation technology, especially in manufacturing. And this is likely to have increased, especially during the last 2 years, when digital people's use of digital products have very much increased. We have been by and large online and buying things online and doing various things using various types of digital technologies. So now manufacturers have a very good excuse with the requirement for social distancing, etc., and so on, to use less labor and more of these machines. And another interesting thing about specifically in the context of India, what you find is that unfortunately, India is placing a lot of emphasis on employment generation through the manufacturing route. We have had several policies which are directed towards this, the most recent being the Make in India program, to make things in India and through that process generate more employment. Okay, but what has been seen is that the labor intensity of manufacturing has been steadily declining in India over the last several years. In fact, there is a study which was done in 2013-14 across 13 typically labor-intensive manufacturing sectors, and there the study has actually shown that the capital intensity of those labor-intensive industries have really increased over the years. So India is trying to promote manufacturing employment at a time when manufacturing sector itself is using more of machines than labor. And these machines are now getting more smart with the arrival of robots itself. Okay, so And then you can see that the share of wages in value added has been steadily declining over a period of time, not just in India, but across the world itself. And then, as I said before, COVID-19 would have, is expected to speed up the rate of automation in manufacturing and services, especially with the requirement for social distancing. And with the arrival of new variants, which are, coming up, and I think we will have to live with this kind of a virus for quite some time. So and this is a good excuse for manufacturers to then use a lot of these automation technologies. And if you look at manufacturing employment in the organized sector of India, which is the annual survey of industry sector, what you find is that the rate of growth of manufacturing employment has been fluctuating, doesn't show any kind of trend at all. These are annual percentage changes in employment in the organized manufacturing sector, which we refer to as the ASI, or the annual survey of industries sector in India. And as I said before, the share of wages in value added has also been declining. Okay. And then, of course, what you can see is that as I said, the price of robots and so on are coming down. And so I think it is much more easy for firms to use a lot of these automation technologies, and robots are becoming much more smarter as well over a period. So that helps them to use a lot of these technologies. So what I would like to present here is that based on secondary source material, what is the real situation? Are robots being used on a very large scale in India's manufacturing sector? And if so, in which industries are they being used? And is this different from the international pattern that you have been seeing? Because we have this data on robots at the international level for a very long period of time, because robots didn't come in the 2000s. They were in existence in the 1970s and 80s. And they've been used extensively by the automotive industry, for instance, in a number of countries. And so has the usage of these robots undergone a lot of changes over the period? So the data source that I'm actually using is an annual survey of the diffusion of robots in a number of countries, published by the International Federation of Robotics, which is an organization based in Germany. And they do an annual survey. And the latest survey actually was published last year in the month of October, and has contained data up to year 2020. You have data on about something like 70 countries and so on. Okay. Now, if you look at the literature on the use of robots, you can see two phases. The first phase is during the 1980s. Actually, this is very rarely referred to. This is a very interesting study by a man called Kenneth Flam from Stanford University, and who had actually looked at the diffusion of robots in Western Europe, Japan, and the United States during the 1980s. Okay. And Flam's study is actually very important because it actually uses a data which is very similar to the International Federation of Robotics data. Okay, and so it is automation is very narrowly defined in terms of robots, because as you know, when you use the term automation, it comprises of a number of heterogeneous technologies. The labor displacing effect of these technologies will vary considerably. For instance, use of a conveyor belt or a forklift truck inside a factory is also automation, but it displaces much less labor compared to a robot, because robots have arms and they can be used for pretty much many functions which human beings can do. Okay, so the second phase of study began with the 2013 with the Frey and Osborne study, which has been, which has received a very high degree of citation. So if you do a Google search, you can see more than 6,000 citations for that Frey and Osborne study. Okay, but the main problem with the Frey and Osborne study is that they have defined automation in terms of computerization and not in terms of use of industrial robots. And they are actually referring to the probability of using machines and the probability of people losing employment. So this is not an actual, empirical study on with ex-post situation. Okay, and so I would not go deep into the literature on use of robots because of want of time, but I can come in if someone is interested in discussing more about it. all that I would say is that I will just take the Kenneth Flam study of the 1980s, because as I said before, it's a very interesting study, uses data which is defines automation specifically in terms of use of robots in manufacturing. And it covers a number of Western European countries, in Japan and the United States during the period 1970 to 84. And what the main findings of the Flam study is very interesting, because Flam has found that robots are used almost entirely only in one industry, which is basically the automotive industry. And even within this automotive industry, it is used only in certain tasks, which are where occupational hazards are very high. And what are these tasks? These tasks are basically welding, and even within welding, it is only arc welding and spot welding, in which a lot of heat is generated, and the occupational hazards are extremely high and so on. Okay, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that although, of course, with the movement of time, there have been some diversification of use of robots to other areas where cognitive skills are not that much required, where repetitive jobs can actually be done. For instance, in the electronics industry for assembling operations, etc., and so on. So, okay, or in material handling and in steel factories, etc., and so on, robots are being used. But by and large, it has been a story of automotive industry, and within automotive industry, it's basically only the specific task of welding, and within that only arc welding and spot welding. And of course, some diversification has happened with the arrival of the electronics industry, etc., and so on. Okay. Now, with this idea in mind, let's now look at the actual data. So I think for you to have some conceptual clarity, you need to have data on use of robots within industries, and within the industry, you require also task-wise. Otherwise, you will not be able to talk about the effect of robots on employment, because in the United States, where they have actually task-wise data available from the 1950s up until now, only one particular task has disappeared, okay? And this is the task of the elevator operator. And in many countries, the elevator operator has been replaced with a security personnel who would then conduct the person. Supposing if you are visiting a multi-story building, earlier the elevator operator was required to take you to the right floor, etc., and so on. But nowadays, what you have is the security staff or the person sitting in the reception is able to give you the directions. And in fact, most people will know exactly the place where they have to go. And so that elevator operator is now not required at all, because that's the only occupation that has actually disappeared as a result in the United States. In other countries, we do not have detailed task-wise data available. Now, if you look at the annual installation of robots in the world, these are in thousands, and you can see that it has been rising. But after 2019, with the recessionary trends in a number of countries, it has now sort of stabilized. And especially during 2020, which is a little bit of a pandemic year, because as you know, the lockdowns in most countries started from March of 2020. So this is basically 9 months of data. And you don't see much increase in the use of robots in the world as a whole. Now, if you look at the annual installation and the geographical spread of this, you can see that it is by and large concentrated in Asia, basically. The blue bars actually basically refers to Asia. The red ones refer to Europe, and the gray bars actually refer to the Americas, which is basically the United States, Canada, and the Latin America all put together. Okay, and you can see that by and large the robot story is basically an Asian story, and it is we know the reason as to why Asia is figuring as an important thing. Now, if you look at the country-wise distribution, you can see that surprisingly, China is the #1 country where lots of robots are used. And then, of course, Japan, and then Korea, and so on. Now, if you run through this list, you can already see a kind of a pattern. Either these countries are major automotive manufacturers, or they are major manufacturers of electronics. Okay, so as I said before, the use of robots is basically confined to these industries. And so that's why basically these countries become very important. So you run through this entire list of these top countries. They are either major manufacturers of electronics or automotive, and some in the case like China and Korea, etc., are both. Okay. And if you look at, again, the task-wise data, which is available from 2015 up till 2020 here, and you can see that, of course, this is basically again, to show that automotive industry continues to be the single largest sector where it is used, followed by electronics industry, and then, of course, metals industry. So by and large, there has not been much diversification away from the usual suspects that Kenneth Lam had talked about to other kinds of industries over such a long period of time. Okay, and then, of course, you can see that who are these major robot manufacturers? They are also the major generators of the robotic technology are also are all automotive firms. So this is based on the number of patents which are issued for robotic family technologies. And you can see that most of the patent families are held by automotive or electronics firms. Okay, so it's basically and if you look at the task-wise story, I'm sorry that these figures are not very clear to you, but I can just tell you that you have to just believe me. By and large, you can see that welding continues to be the most important task where robots are used, and within welding, it is arc welding and spot welding. Of course, there is a little bit of diversification into handling and material handling sectors as well. Now, if you come to the Indian situation, what you find is that the annual installation of robots has increased just from 776. This is not in thousands, it's just in numbers. So it's just 776 robots to about 3,200 over the years. But again, you can see that even in India, just like the international pattern, you can see that the annual installations have turned negative both in 2019 and 20. So you don't see a kind of increase in the, and if you look at the operational stock, which is also important because annual installations are, are the flow. And then if you look at the stock of these robots, that also shows actually a kind of a decline, and it shows a kind of a fluctuation over the years. There's no clear trend as such. And if you look at the density of robots in manufacturing industry, and according to the International Federation of Robotics, it is actually negligible. And the density is calculated on the basis of number of robots per 10,000 labor force. So you take 10,000 labor force, how many robots are there? So in India, it has gone up from 1 to 6. But this is a slight underestimate because I don't know the kind of data which they have used for measuring employment. If you replace that with the annual survey of industries data, because robots are used basically in the organized manufacturing sector, it is slightly higher, and I'll come back to that point a little later. Now, if you look at the task-wise...
So, Sunil, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
We'll have to wind up because it's about 20 minutes already.
Okay, I will just wind up. So if you look at the task-wise distribution, you find again, you find that it is basically in welding, because welding continues to be a very important, almost like 52% of the robots which are used are actually in welding and soldering, and the rest in material handling, etc. and so on. The density of robots in India has, as I said, if you measure it using the annual survey of industries data, is slightly higher. It is now about 16 robots per 10,000 labor force. The IFR data was actually showing it to be 6, but it is actually higher at about 16 for the organized manufacturing sector. But it's much less compared to, say, for instance, China and the world as a whole. China is 246 robots per 10,000 labor force. World as a whole is about 126. And the density of robots in the automotive industry, again, in India, if you look at that, has been quite high. It has gone up from about 45 to 184. But again, you see that it is concentrated essentially in, that is, I would argue, it's basically a scale effect, because more number of automotive products are manufactured in India now than before. And so there is more welding and soldering, which is happening now. And so that's why the density has actually increased. But if you look at the share of automotive sector in total manufacturing employment, it's only about 6%. Okay, so the automotive industry is not a major. I'm talking about the organized manufacturing of automotive, which includes both the vehicles and auto parts manufacturers. They account only for about 6% of the, or 6 or 7% of the total organized manufacturing employment. And within that, robots are used only in a particular task, which is very small, and so the use of robotic use doesn't really have as of now a negative effect on manufacturing employment as far as India is concerned. But this is likely to change in the years to come, because you can find a number of interesting technologies which are driving automation, are themselves developing very fast that too in an exponential fashion. For instance, computing performance is growing in an exponential fashion, and then you have improvements in electromechanical designs, and also numerically controlled manufacturing tools are increasing. Improvements in electrical storage, I'm referring to lithium-ion batteries. For instance, improvements in electronics power efficiency is increased. And you have wireless technologies. We are now talking about 5G technologies, which can also, and then of course, the scale and performance of the internet is also increasing. And then of course, worldwide data storage has also increased, and computing power is also increasing. A combined effect of all these is that robots will become more powerful in the years to come. And many other activities which we thought are not automatable may become automatable in the future. So their negative effect on manufacturing employment in the future is a different story than what I have tried to present. Okay, I think that's all I have to say, and thank you so much for your patience.
Thanks, Sunil. Thanks a lot. The next speaker is Dr. Salim Rehlan. Dr. Salim Rehlan is a professor of economics in Dhaka University. He is also a very active executive director of the South Asian Network on Economic Modeling. And he'll be presenting basically a case study of Bangladesh and its preparedness.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. And I must thank the organizers for inviting me to this excellent conference. Actually, I have been a regular participant of this conference. I feel really privileged to be part of it. So this presentation, I will try to focus not only on Bangladesh, but some global perspective as well. But I will try to draw some lessons for Bangladesh. And I don't think I have to spend time on defining fourth industrial revolution. We all know that, and also Honorable Chair, at the beginning, he talked about that and how it drastically changed the pace and scope of automation of tasks previously done by the humans, and other features as well. But fourth industrial revolution brought these frontier technologies, and we know that. And these are the list of technologies we have been talking, and my earlier two presenters also mentioned a few of them. But if we look at the market size estimates of the frontier technologies, this is the study done by UNCTAD. They tried to show, and it's definitely, you can see that it's pre-COVID was on 2018, and they kind of projected that between 2018 and 2025, the market size of this frontier technology may increase from 350 billion to 3.2 trillion. I'm not sure to what extent this will be realized because of the disruption during COVID. But despite that, it shows that it has huge potentials, even if it's not 2025, even if it's a few years from now on, that still there are huge size of market for many countries to gain out of it. But now this is something interesting. We talk about technological change, and this is one of the interesting studies which actually trying to show that with the technological change and industrial revolution, there's a growing disparity between developing countries and developed countries. And they're focusing more on the center and periphery concept, especially how the core countries and the center countries, they are actually gaining, whether the periphery countries, they're actually losing out. So UNCTAD was not using this center periphery concept, but they were using more of the very developed countries and developing country concept. And that still shows that over the last 5 decades, actually the per capita income at constant prices, the developed countries, the disparity between the developed countries and developing countries is actually widening. So fundamental question would be definitely, as we are talking about this industrial revolution, as we're talking about this technological change, we are seeing wider disparity at the global level. And also there are serious concerns about wider disparity within the country, especially with respect to the initial endowment of technology, the access to technology, and how different dynamics take place while these technological innovations take place in different industries. UNCTAD also came up with this country readiness index, especially the index they comprised, they calculated using 5 building blocks: ICT development, skills, R&D activity, industry activity, and access to finance. And we can see that there's a huge even disparity there too, especially the way Western countries, they are actually well ahead of the Asian average. Again, Asia, it shows that within countries, there are huge different disparities within Asia. But despite the Asian average, actually it touches the world average. but the Latin American, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa are well behind the world average. But now, if you look at the country readiness index, and the ranking is among the 158 countries, Bangladesh performs very poorly. You can see the country ranking is 112. And if you look at several components of this readiness index, actually in most of these indices, Bangladesh perform very poor. For India performs well in some of the indices. India is better, is doing better, but in certain cases also India is not really doing better. You can see the skills ranking. India's case also, India is also lagging behind. In general, most of the South Asian countries are not really doing great compared to China or some of the Southeast Asian countries. One big concern is that for a country like Bangladesh is that these frontier technologies are now is actually penetrating in most of the sectors. And I've just tried to highlight this red one is the manufacturing, because Bangladesh has been a kind of champion of manufacturing in over the last few decades, especially the way the ready-made garments grew. And Bangladesh just very recently lost the position to Vietnam, being the second largest exporter of ready-made garments. But definitely the story of the growth of ready-made garments is remarkable in Bangladesh. And also the data shows that in contrast to even India, Bangladesh so far has been able to avoid this kind of so-called premature deindustrialization, but it's extremely driven or riding on very much on the ready-made garments. But these ready-made garments, and it's the manufacturing, and now the issue is in this manufacturing, these frontier technologies are everywhere. So, and then this is also pushing quite a lot in the Bangladesh ready-made garments manufacturing sector to actually adopt this technology to remain competitive, especially the fact that some estimates show that it directly employs around 4 million workers, and around 60% of them are women, which initially 20 years back was around 80% of them are women. But now indirectly, it also employs another 4 million or 5 million workers. So it has a huge employment generation impact. But now if these kind of frontier technologies are being adopted by the ready-made garments industry, that is going to have some big implications for the future of the employment in this particular sector. But now, when you talk about these implications of the employment, definitely it can go through multiple channels. We are talking about the quantity of employment, the way I was trying to tell you, especially the ready-made garment story, but at the same time, the quality of employment. And I think our earlier presentations talked about Rana Plaza and different other issues, especially how to ensure the working condition, proper work conditions, safety and safety procedures in the factories. And that is going to put some additional pressure on the whole dynamics of the ready-made garment story in Bangladesh. And we don't know yet what's going to take place, because it has a strong political economy or institutional setting, which we really need to take into account. And probably when you talk about this fourth industrial revolution and its impact, which we often probably don't touch upon those political economy or institutional aspects. To tell you very briefly about the kind of employment or broad economic sector and income groupings, we can see Bangladesh belongs to this lower middle income category. And you can see that the share of agriculture in employment declined. And the share in 2020 is for the low income, middle income average is 37%, which is very close to Bangladesh's average, around 38%. But you can see that a huge percentage of the service sector, as well as some important percentage of the manufacturing sector. But what is really worrying is that a huge proportion of the low-skilled workers, despite that, we have the transformation from agriculture to manufacturing or services, the huge concentration of low-skilled workers who are the most vulnerable of this fourth industrial revolution or adaptation of these frontier technologies. And that is something is going to remain a big concern for Bangladesh. So I think I talked about this, the jobs, which jobs are likely to be affected. If I take the example of ready-made garments, there are 7 grades of workers, the ready-made garments, in a typical garments factory. And at the lower grade, were mostly the unskilled workers. And especially after the Rana Plaza event, we saw that there's an increasing intensity of factories to adopt more of the automation or this kind of frontier technology, which is replacing this lower end or lower productive, or sorry, I would say low skilled workers at the initial stages. Now these workers are mostly the women workers. So that means, as I said earlier, that it's going to have severe implication for the low-skilled workers as well as the women workers. But definitely it is going to have some implications for or creating new opportunities for new kinds of jobs, especially I think our past two presenters, they talked about, especially Dr. Umar, she talked about how in the services sectors, through different value chains, we are seeing different kinds of services are based on e-commerce and different other digital platforms. But at the same time, we have to take into account that these digital platforms are actually facilitating the services or facilitating the value chain. But the whole manufacturing, most of the manufacturing, as she rightly mentioned, is actually still taking place within the kind of earlier fashion way. When you talk about the impact, we mostly concentrate on the economic impact. Probably we bring in some of the societal impact, especially on the labor, employment, and the poverty, and some on the income effect. But I think the whole dynamics of the political impact or the political economic issues need to be taken into account, especially I would say this role of the government in the case of how to maintain a sense of cohesion in facing disruption to the economic, social, and political landscape. Understand the changing role of government. I think this is something we need to think in the future as well. How the role of the government changed are you talking about digital government versus analog government? Because the technologies are changing, the platforms are changing. Cultivate an understanding of the fourth industrial revolution and the risk and opportunities it presents. At this moment, I think the discussion was still at the sectoral level by the private sector, but I haven't seen much discussion is taking place with the engagement, engaging both the private sector and the public sector, and ensure the necessary infrastructure is in place to take advantage of its opportunities. And when you talk about the infrastructure, we talk about three kinds of infrastructure: physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and social infrastructure. In my next few slides, I'll be focusing more a bit on the social infrastructure. But now on the policy questions, I think this is the portion I have just left these questions for discussions. I think how do you manage the transition and impact? What policies do we need to protect societies and human rights? Development of critical infrastructure, balance information, ensure service and opportunities availability, and how might the development pathway change, and what kind of new legal infrastructure required? I think this is also is going to be very, very important. So now, when you talk about the strategic thrust in Bangladesh, I think there is a serious need for policy reorientation. The kind of heavy focus on one particular sector, which lacks economic diversification, and we are, as I mentioned earlier, that we are riding on ready-made garments. I think the kind of where, if we talk about conventional policies, economic policies, trade policies, industrial policies, they're very much tuned to cater, only very concentrated sectors. Second, on the technology-induced transformation, very little work is done on this technology-induced transformation, especially how you can promote technology, how you promote R&D, and finally on the investment-led transformation. The kind of investment that is taking place is not really linking, or we don't see the kind of harmonization in the kind of investment where the public sector investment, the private sector investment, and which can actually cater the need of the fourth industrial revolution. Just to give you very briefly on the social infrastructure, I thought to highlight two important areas, one on the health and on the education. The reason I'm highlighting on health is that, when we're talking about more productive or more skilled workers to face the challenges of fourth industrial revolution, health should be one of the important component or pillars. And you can see that Bangladesh spends very little, in terms of public health expenditures percent of GDP, as well as the out-of-pocket health expenditure is one of the highest in the world. And also in the education, the average years of schooling, you can see that it's very low, still very low. And also the public expenditure of education as percent of GDP is also one of the lowest in this region. My final slide is on these areas of major reforms. I think when you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, there's a kind of disconnect I can see. I have seen the policymakers in Bangladesh, they want to really focus on this fourth industrial revolution, when they want to mention in the 5-year plans or other policy documents. But how do you really link with the third industrial revolution or the second industrial revolution? Many parts of the country are not even passed through the second industrial revolution. How do you link these phases? So that's why we need reforms in critical economic domains, in different trade policies, in economic policies, in industrial policies, whether they are really, very much in line with to adopt the challenges of fourth industrial revolution. I really want to emphasize on the institutional reform. What kind of sectors you want to promote, what kind of support you want to provide, and how do you provide the support, given the fact that there is a huge policy bias within the institutional setting. I talked about the education, the lack of education spending, and the kind of generating quality education. We need reform in education. And finally, of course, on reform in science and technology. I took exactly 14 minutes and I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair.
Thanks, Salim. Our next speaker is Dr. Milan Tesserin. She did a PhD, a doctoral work in Sao Paulo University in Brazil and presently teaching in Utrecht University in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much for the invitation for this conference. I would like, it's a pleasure to have this space to explore different perspectives from the Global South with the colleagues. And today I would like to talk about the labor market transformations, showing an overview of the Brazilian formal labor market and its disparities in terms of regions, industries, and gender. In the case of labor-intensive subsectors, such as automotive and electronics, the prospect of adopting new technologies is lower because, as I told you, the capital labor ratio is already quite high. But even inside this group, considering only, for example, electronics, the equipment in a factory in Germany are different from a factory in Brazil, because in Germany, they use up-to-date technologies, while in Brazil, there is a technological gap, which interferes with the possibilities of adopting new technologies. And on the other hand, in labor-intensive subsectors, we may consider that there is more space to replace workers with new technologies, but there is also another factor. The low cost of labor in Global South countries, compared to the high cost of new technology, can be a major obstacle to this replacement. And another relevant factor to take into account when we're dealing with technologies related to fourth industrial revolution is that there is a technological barrier to internalize them, since most companies in the Global South have not even completed the third industrial revolution. So it's not a simple step to take. Now, in addition to industries, the impact of new technologies on the labor market also differs by gender. Some authors stated that new technologies reinforce the gender gap significantly because women mostly occupy positions unrelated to STEAM occupations, those ones related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It means that opportunities may not be fully accessible to women because they do not have the skills related to such occupations that are more associated with new technologies. Other point is that the tasks performed by women are more related to tasks that can be coded. Generally, women are more likely to perform routine and repetitive tasks that can be replaced by machines. Women are also less involved in analytical tasks, while men are more involved in all these kind of positions. One well-known paper that was already quoted here in the conference it's the paper from Frey and Osborne that evaluated the risk of occupations being replaced by new technologies. Based on an evaluation with experts regarding the probability of automation of a wide range of tasks, these authors identified that 47% of occupations in the United States labor market are susceptible to replacement. And from this study, several others sought to identify the percentage of occupations at a high risk in different countries. For the global north, on average, the results indicate that the probability of a replacement is high, above 60%, and varies according to the type and the intensity of industry subsectors in each country. For the global south, we found few studies. For example, Chang and Yuin analyzed 5 Southeast Asian countries and found that about 56% of employment is at high replacement risk. Another study focused on 11 countries in Africa, Asia, South America, and Eastern Europe, found an average automation risk of 63%, but it also varies considerably among countries according to formal education level. There are 2 specific studies for Brazil. One point out that about 56% of workers are in occupations with high or medium-high risk of automation. And in this case, workers with lower educational levels and wages are even more at risk. The second study found a similar percentage, and the authors argue that these occupations are concentrated in activities intensive in routine skills and low cognitive levels. Thereby, automation may be feasible from a technological point of view, but not viable depending on the country's industrial structure and development level. All these contrasts in terms of North and South, technological readiness, industry profile, and so on, can also be seen within Brazil. That's why I was interested in working on a detailed view to investigate Brazil's regional inequality. As you know, besides being a territorially large country with more than 50 million workers in the formal labor market, Brazil has deep regional inequalities in income, population, education, access to public services, and the innovation system. Brazil has a manufacturing industry that is very diversified for a global South country, as it is in the top 15 in the world in almost all manufacturing subsectors. The country also has a robust agro-industrial subsector in the central area of the country, and a mature services sector in South and Southeast region. However, large part of the national GDP is concentrated in the South and the Southeast region, which also sustain the most diversified productive structure and attract more qualified workers, in contrast to the North and the Northeast region, which have a little diversified economies, a smaller number of companies, and less technological content. To carry out analysis of these changes in the labor market in Brazil, I used a database that covers more than 50 million workers for the formal labor market. And I split all this information by gender, manufacturing industry, and regions. We have analyzed the changes in the last decade, in which the adoption of new technologies is being more pronounced. Therefore, we use the period from 2011 to 2019. Like other authors, we draw on the article from Frey and Osborne to select occupations with the highest and the lowest risk of digitalization. In total, these authors classified 702 occupations according to their probability of digitalization. We created a correspondence table between the occupation list provided by Frey and Osborne and the Brazilian occupational list. And then we classified the occupations into 2 groups. The first is the higher digitalization risk, which includes occupations with probability of digitalization equal or greater than 75%. And the second, the group is the lower digitalization risk, which includes all occupations with less than 75% of probability. The first group concentrate about 33% of all Brazilian occupations. Now I want to show you how the results vary by gender, industry, even in the same country. Here, looking at the number of occupations classified as high risk, we see that they correspond to 32.5% of the current occupations code in the national manufacturing sector. However, it represents more than 60% of the total employment in 2019. On the other side, occupations classified as low risk to digitalization correspond to 67.5% of the occupations code, but they represent 39.6% of the employment in the same year. In other words, in Brazil, 6 out of 10 manufacturing jobs are highly likely to be replaced by equipment that incorporates new technologies. Here, to get an idea of which occupations
you might have to wind up in 2-3 minutes.
Sorry, more 3?
Yeah, yes, about
Okay.
15 minutes now.
I will try to go fast. So here I would like to show the occupations that we are talking. Just when we look to the top 10 occupations in terms of employment in Brazil, we can see that 7 are at high risk and only 3 in low risk. I will go fast here. This graph shows the employment share in manufacturing subsectors by digitalization risk in 2011. We grouped the subsectors by technological intensity according to UNIDO by low, medium, and high tech groups. And although there is substantial subsectoral heterogeneity according to digitalization risk, almost all subsectors had more than half of jobs at high risk of digitalization. Okay, I'll go fast here to show the other results. Here is the distribution of manufacturing employment in the Brazilian regions by the degree of digitalization risk. We can see that the share of occupations with a high risk is structural, as there were no significant variation between 2011 and 2019. But we can also see that regions differ. On average, 60% of occupations are at a high risk of automation in Brazil. But in the South, one of the most advanced regions, it reaches 65%. In turn, in the Northwest, one of the most backward regions, along with the North region, has the lower risk. North region is an interesting case because although it is a backward region, there is an export incentive zone there, where basically companies operate like a maquila. And there is no more much industrial activities outside of the zone. So we understand that it explains why there is a greater proportion of high-risk jobs there. Just to show here about gender now. We can see that male and female share of jobs at a high risk also fluctuates between regions. But first, it's essential to note that male workers are the majority in the Brazilian manufacturing subsectors and regions. They represent more than 7 out of 10 jobs in 2/3 of subsectors in Brazil. So it is to be expected that the proportion of male jobs are at a high risk of digitalization will be higher than the female portion. So overall, we found that 63% of male jobs were at high risk against 57% of female jobs in 2011. And there are some variations between regions. I will go fast, just more 2 minutes maybe. Now I will show the variation in employment between 2011 and 2019. In this period, manufacturing employment dropped 11.9%, and there was a loss of 936,000 of jobs in Brazil, with 2/3 of these jobs eliminated related to occupations at high risk of automation. Now, when we look at the variation jobs by gender and the regions, we found a pattern. For Brazil and all regions, despite the smaller share of women in the labor market, female occupations with a high digitalization risk showed a greater retraction than male occupations. And the opposite happened in the scenario of occupations with lower digitalization risk, where men were most susceptible. Now, just going to my final points, we can conclude that most jobs in the Brazilian manufacturing sector are at high risk of digitalization. We also verified the substantial heterogeneity between manufacturing subsectors regarding the digitalization risk, which can be explained by capital and the labor intensity characteristics. We also confirmed the inequalities at the regional level. Employment digitalization risk is more significant in regions with higher GDP per capita than lagged regions, with some exceptions, for example, the North region. Although all Brazilian regions registered a drop in the employment, there is a regional inequality in the intensity of jobless. And the decline was most significant in occupations with the highest digitalization risk, and even more pronounced among women than men in all regions. So what we see we believe is that all this heterogeneity probably also repeats in other global south. Therefore, such inequalities are crucial elements for designing future public policies to improve the educational, regional, social, and the labor market in Brazil. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Milen. Our next and last speakers are Ruth Castle-Franco and David Francis. Both of them are associated with the Southern Centre. Ruth is the research manager of the Future of Work project. We've been speaking to them for over 3 years without meeting, and we are continuing this tradition today. So please, Ruth and Francis.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you to the IHD and to the Indian Society of Labor Economists for really anchoring, organizing this panel. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. The paper that we are going to present is really the beginning of a sort of reaction, I would say, a sort of polemical response to some of the debates, particularly on the African continent, around the changing nature of work and the role of the state. There is among progressive scholars, some progressive scholars, a growing argument that given the patterns of premature deindustrialization and de-agrarianization across the African continent, it is critical to decenter these debates that we've been having today around the organization of production and the nature of work, and rather to refocus on redistribution. In fact, I was just at a conference where one scholar suggested that perhaps Uber is a model for African economies as they try to position themselves in the service sector, in the global service sector, with the state then picking up the slack through expansive forms of social protection. And so this paper really tries to challenge some of these debates head on, and in many ways is a conceptual paper. Now, the role of the state in reducing inequality has been the subject of much debate. Redistributive policies such as publicly funded social protection have garnered increasing attention as a growing proportion of the world's population becomes seemingly, and I say seemingly, surplus to the accumulation needs of capital. In South Africa, a country marked by endemic levels of unemployment, working poverty, and very high levels of inequality, a universal basic income guarantee has garnered increasing political traction.
Ruth, sorry, is there also a presentation alongside, or is this, I mean, are you, because we
this is all, thank you so much, Prof. This is all the preamble. We'll jump into the next slide. We don't have the However, a closer look at the structure of inequality points to the need for renewed focus on pre-distribution policies, even as political support for redistribution grows. South Africa has an expanded social grant system funded by a progressive tax structure, which has reduced the incidence and severity of poverty and tempered post-tax inequality, as we'll see. However, pre-tax inequality has been left largely intact. In this paper, we argued that we need to alter the structure of the economy using the levers of economic, industrial, and spatial policy, competition regulation, and labor market interventions.
So Ravi, I just wanted to check that our slides are showing. Can you see the map?
Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay, thanks. So I think it's no surprise to people familiar with South Africa that the post-apartheid period, which is now approaching 30 years, has been characterized by sustained levels of high unemployment and inequality. And the first sort of 25 years of the post-apartheid period was characterized by declining poverty, but in the last 7 years, that's changed, and poverty is starting to increase as per capita incomes have declined. South Africa is consistently measured at having the highest income inequality in the world, and more recent work done by some of our colleagues at SCIS show that we also have the worst wealth inequality in the world, and that's stayed basically the same since the end of apartheid. And this graph here just shows in kind of visceral color coding the Gini coefficient for income from World Bank data, and you can see South Africa is by far the most unequal country in the world, and that's, as I said, remained the same. I think one of the important things to think about in terms of the labor market is that in the post-apartheid economy, the labor market has created jobs fairly consistently until 2019, but it's not done so at a rate that can absorb new entrants to the labor market, particularly women and low-skilled workers. And another characteristic is that the informal economy is much smaller than we would expect, both for a country at South Africa's level of income and development, but also at one with such high unemployment. So this puts our unemployment rates in perspective against other sub-Saharan African countries. Their average is about 6 or 7%. South Africa has for long been in the high 20s. And most recently, this is a graph of our unemployment rate since 2008. And we can see that unemployment has increased consistently at the same time that employment has increased. So we've had growing employment and growing unemployment because the labor market is growing faster than the number of new jobs. But the crisis is kind of evident from 2020 onwards. That blip is a definitional problem with asking people if they're searching for work during a COVID lockdown, which lowered our unemployment rate temporarily. It's an aberration. But you can see in the post-COVID period, unemployment has accelerated rapidly. And that's because for the first time really in the last 2 decades, we've now started to lose jobs. So the trend of job creation has ended. And for the last 2 years now, we've seen consistent job destruction and an actual net decrease in the level of employment. But South Africa also remains very spatially segregated. Our cities and our urban areas are still shaped very much, they look like apartheid cities. Public transport is fragmented and poor quality, and that means that job search costs are very high and looking for work is very time consuming. So I think it was unsurprising that in July 2021, South Africa had this unprecedented national uprising and national revolt, which the causes are highly contested, but it did, very to a large extent highlight the deepening crisis of social reproduction, which was exacerbated by COVID-19, but certainly wasn't caused by it. It was a long time coming. Our most recent employment statistics, for example, showed that our expanded unemployment rate is 46.2%, which is the highest I think that's ever been recorded. And more than 2/3 or 3/4 of the unemployed have been unemployed for more than a year, showing that kind of long-term nature of unemployment. Meanwhile, even being employed doesn't ensure that households can meet their basic needs. Prior to the introduction of the national minimum wage in 2018, more than half of all workers earn below the line of working poverty. And this is largely due to widespread and increasing labor casualization. Notably and problematically, patterns of unemployment and working poverty both reflect and reproduce historical inequalities along the lines of race and gender, among others. And I think it's important for the purposes of this paper and our arguments to point out that the inequality is not a static phenomenon. It's not a continuation of something that happened during apartheid and then has remained the same. Inequality is continually produced and reproduced by the private sector and by the economic activity that happens. As I said, the Gini coefficient has remained above 0.6 throughout the post-apartheid period. And this is despite changes in ownership and gender in terms of the distribution of the labor market, income and wealth. And part of this problem is that our economic policy has so far been unable to overcome these challenges. We've had decades of sluggish economic growth as a result, declining investment.
David, in case you're intending to, we are still on the same slide, which says the unemployment.
We just have a few slides for illustrations.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, that's
fine. There's been declining investment in productive sectors. Some of the earlier presentations about manufacturing. South Africa has consistently had a declining share of both employment and output in manufacturing in the last almost 2 decades now. So our argument is that while South Africa's kind of triple challenge of inequality, unemployment, and poverty is structural and has historical causes, the state can and must play a transformative role, not only on the redistributive side, but in shaping the terms of accumulation, production, and redistribution. Of course, what policy tools the states leverage is a political question, and reflects, as Mkhandawira argued, the relative power forces in society.
So, spurred by popular revolt, including the July 2021 popular protests, our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, came out in support of a universal basic income guarantee for all adults between the ages of 18 and 59 years. Effectively, then, an unemployment benefit with quite sort of generous ways of defining who is unemployed, right? It isn't, in fact, for all individuals, as UBI has been conceived in other contexts. Now, South Africa has one of the most expansive social grant systems in Africa, which is a reflection of past histories of expropriation of land and high levels of proletarianization. This is actually very different from the structures of social grants in other African countries. And it reaches more than 18 million people. And now nearly 1 in 2 South Africans receive some kind of social grant benefit. You can see that the largest here on the table, the top ones are kind of your established ones. And the largest are the child support grant, then the old age grant, followed by the disability grant. And you can see what the sort of relative amounts of funds or value of the transfers are. But the COVID pandemic created the opportunity to expand the social grant system to one group that had been historically excluded. And those are working age adults, able-bodied working age adults, whose needs were in part covered through something called the Expanded Public Works Program, which established essentially a grant, a transfer in exchange for participation, initially in labor-intensive public works and then others, but these were all conditional. So the social relief of distress grant introduced during the COVID period was the first unconditional cash transfer to the unemployed. And this reflected, I think, a recognition that even those considered able-bodied adults were unable ultimately to meet their basic needs because of the lack of employment opportunities. Most social protection systems across the African continent make this differentiation between deserving and undeserving poor, essentially. And then labor capacity becomes a sort of key defining element. Now, proponents of universal basic income guarantee argue that the institutionalization of this grant, of the social relief of distress grant, would be a way towards reaching basically a UBIG for the unemployed, and that the level should be increased at least to the lower bound poverty line, if not the upper bound poverty line, and this would fill the cracks of South Africa's social security system. However, not all within government were convinced, and in fact, the former finance minister argued that we must also focus on the production side of the economy, that there must be some work, and that this is the discipline that goes with work in society and not just grants here or there. Now, study after study has shown that South Africa's unemployed would also prefer a proper job to a social grant. And so what we see in the political discourse is this use of the trope of the lazy or undeserving poor that continues to resurface in order to undermine attempts to expand the redistribution of the social surplus from capital to labor. However, the point that production matters is essential, even if not as the minister originally intended. Social policy in South Africa has been largely confined in recent times to social assistance for those that have been excluded from the labor market. And within that then loses its broader developmental aims. And so this brand of, let's say, new welfare economics, right, abstracts in many ways from the structures of or the causes of poverty and inequality and the wider social and political and economic processes that have led to expropriation, exploitation, and social exclusion, in the process often overlooking the macroeconomic dynamics and economic strategies that could generate more and better employment. And these ultimately leave the terms of accumulation unchecked.
And I think it's important to note that good social policy can contribute to inclusive growth through the provision of social welfare, particularly the expansion of high quality social goods, which could increase aggregate demand and improve social cohesion. And that has some intrinsic value too. But in South Africa, the private sector has continued to thrive in the post-apartheid period. It's a very profitable place to do business. And as we've said, this reproduces these past patterns of inequality. Our healthcare system is one such example. The healthcare system, 10% of the population uses private healthcare and 90% uses public healthcare, but the private healthcare consumes 50% of all healthcare resources. And attempts at introducing a national health insurance have been stymied both by the private sector, but also within political trading of this kind of discussion about whether EU-BIG would, take up the fiscal space that could otherwise provide private healthcare. So we're arguing that it's really important to move away from thinking of social policy as a set of social nets and towards social development, which sees social policy as an integrated part of development policy along with economic policy. So to do so, social policy mustn't be secondary to macroeconomic considerations, but nor must it be seen as a kind of tack-on that's conceived in a vacuum, which, as Ruth said, is increasingly the case in South Africa. And I think to underscore this point, this graph that we're showing, that high and rising inequality in South Africa is a problem of production. It's not a problem of insufficient redistribution. This graph shows the extensive redistribution as a share of national income that is both very high for the top decile, but it has also increased a lot since between 1993 and 2009. So the redistributive system in South Africa does an excellent job of moving resources from the rich who consume, achieve a high share of income, but also earn a high share of wealth. But this hasn't made a difference to the way the economy generates these really high levels of pre-tax inequality in the first place. And there are many factors, of course, that contribute to this. One of them is our highly concentrated product markets on the side of it. So this is a picture of an informal trading store. But what's remarkable about it, despite the fact that it's informal and in a rural area, all those brand names that are pictured are brand names owned by big industrial conglomerates and multinational corporations. And I think South Africa is not unique in this way, but it is different, I think, to some other developing countries, that even in far reaches of rural South Africa, you have the reach of South Africa's highly efficient, highly industrialized core. And this makes us have a very capital intensive economy that also has very high barriers to entry for small and informal workers. As I said, we also have this persistent spatial inequality, and this large size of our formal economy precludes informal economic participation. So of course, a UBI could address the crisis that we currently face of hunger, poverty, and inequality in the short term, but it's not a replacement for types of social provisioning and a type of economy that decommodifies life and labor. And it certainly can't achieve the fundamental economic and spatial restructuring that we need. So we're arguing ultimately that production and redistribution are two sides of the same coin. The struggles about what is produced, how it's produced, and for whom remain as critical as discussions about how things are redistributed. And there's kind of three particular struggles we wanted to highlight around employment creation, pushing back against informalization, and extending labor and social protections. So to underscore that point, the task of creating a more egalitarian society doesn't lie only in the realm of redistribution, but in production. So economic policy, we think, needs to focus on three key areas, amongst others, to complement social policy and work to reduce inequality. The first is obviously tackling our unemployment problem. South Africa's kind of catastrophically high levels of unemployment need a broader approach that goes beyond social policy protections and also beyond labor market policy, to think about competition policy to lower the concentration in product markets that I talked about, facilitate new entrants both in the formal and the informal sector, and also to expand ownership and control in the economy. Economic participation, it's critical that it's broadened to allow small-scale production. The industrial development path of South Africa in the 20th century has kind of done completely the opposite and allowed high concentration, both in terms of labor, of share of the economy, but also power in the economy. And this has also led to a high capital to labor ratio, which has curtailed employment growth even in periods where we've had economic growth.
And then we have focused on questions of the regulatory role of the state. You know, post-apartheid, there were revisions to the labor regulations, but we also saw a process of externalization and outsourcing. And in many ways, the digital labor platforms have extended these processes of casualization to other sectors. And I think that's already been discussed, so we won't get into too much detail. I think we're short on time, but simply to say that we have been thinking about what it means to regulate global labor platforms given their diversity, and without undermining the various sort of autonomous forms of organization that have emerged. And that requires rethinking what are the terms of labor regulation, and also what are the forms of organization and how to respond to strengthen and extend labor and social protections to workers that are essentially being misclassified as partners, entrepreneurs, own account workers, while at the same time not undermining what they see as their various forms of autonomy. And I think this is a highly contradictory process, and I look forward to discussing it further. And finally, I don't know if you want to speak about the question around spatial legacy of apartheid.
I mean, just to say that, you know, economic policy alone cannot overcome the spatial development of South Africa. I mean, if you look at maps of electricity provision, you know, they map very closely onto the old Bantustans and onto South Africa's urban planning. And really very little has been done to address this, and it's often left out completely of discussions about economic policy. But of course, linking back to social policy in the short term, interventions like that, changing South Africa's spatial layout, changing the concentration of the economy, cannot be done quickly. And social policy, amongst many other functions, has an urgent role to play in supporting workers and citizens in the intervening period. But the task of kind of creating a more egalitarian society cannot be left to social policy alone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ruth and David. So I'll first invite Imran. And Imran, although we're running out of time, could you take a minute to just also talk about the research agenda, the future research agenda of the Southern Centre? And then, of course, your comments on the papers.
So let me start by just thanking the organizers for kind of having this session. It's a great pity that we can't be there to kind of join you. The kind of session comes out of a kind of set of thinking kind of in our Inequality Centre that we started a few years ago around the kind of question of the future of work and the fact that there was not much kind of evidence. There was not much consideration. There was not much acknowledgement of the impacts of the fourth industrial revolution or technical change in general on labor markets in the global south. And it's really pleasing then to see the kind of papers that we've had today, and to see the growth in kind of research in this area. So our work on the future of work is kind of supported by the Ford Foundation and by the IITRoorkee, and I'd just like to acknowledge their role in kind of supporting this work across the globe, and kind of in a select number of global south countries. So just a few thoughts on the papers. So if we were, so Gayatri is going to focus a bit more on the kind of actual employment issues. We split the task, and I thought I would say a few things about technology in general. So we could think about 4 impacts of technology on employment. The first is we could think about it in terms of the macro numbers. Is this phase of technology development going to kind of result in a massive decline in jobs in the global south, or is it not? And I think across the papers that we've had today, I think the answer would be we have some kind of significant areas for concern, and I think the Brazil and the South African paper draw that out. But really, we don't know enough yet about the total what that total picture would look like. The second area that we could focus on is to ask if it's going to have any particular impacts on particular sectors or on particular groups of workers. And I think here we have some fascinating results from the papers that we've had. I think Sunil's piece on kind of how technology is impacting in terms of the adoption of kind of robotics kind of suggests that the sectoral impacts might be quite important. I think Uma's highlighting of the fact that the real impact is on kind of that there's a disproportionate impact on female workers, but her highlighting of young workers, I think, is an extremely important issue and something that we need, I think, a lot more research on. The third area would be to ask about what kind of how's the space of technology impacting on power relationships in the labor market, and the kind of respective shares going to capital and kind of going to labor. And I think here the results are kind of overwhelmingly kind of suggesting that the labor shares declining, power of employers is increasing significantly. And I think the work that's kind of happening globally on technology, power concentrations, monopsony markets, etc., really speaks to this, to kind of this question. A fourth area we could explore would be whether different types of technologies might have different impacts. We kind of often think of these technologies as one type, but I think what comes out of the papers is a kind of suggestion, perhaps, that we need to unpack this a little more. For example, Uma's piece around algorithms suggests a very different trend to the robotics argument that Sunil was making. But I think what these papers collectively suggest is that no matter how you think about those 4 issues, levels of inequality in countries in the global south are kind of increasing, and that these developments in technology and their kind of impact on employment are kind of really driving that growth in inequality. That, of course, then raises the policy question about what should we do about this. I think the South African paper by David and Ruth kind of highlights perhaps the shortcomings from a global south perspective of the standard kind of solution that is proposed. So in the global south, and I mean in the global north, and in much of the technology promoting literature, the kind of idea of a universal basic income grant, I think, has gained lots of power. My sense is that this completely ignores the reality of kind of how social policies work in developing countries, the kind of scope and kind of especially the fiscal space for kind of social policies that would deal with this problem, I think is severely limited in global south countries. And I think David and Ruth's piece highlights that. That then, of course, raises, well, what else could the policy response be? I think there's 2 kind of areas, and I'm going to close on this. The first is we kind of really have to think about policies outside of the fiscal space. And I think here, policies that address the power imbalances in the labor market that are being driven by tech, I think are really important. And there's a congruence here between competition policies, which kind of highlight the market distorting kind of effects of this power in terms of consumer markets. I think we have to make that link to the labor market as well. Finally, I think technology change is seen as some process that we have very little power over. I think there's important issues of global north, global south differences here. But I think a kind of agenda for all global south countries is really a lot more kind of international pressure around how technology is being introduced, and further kind of oversight of some of these scientific markets, and how adoption in kind of global south countries imposes costs on how adoption in the global north is imposing quite substantial costs on countries in the global south. For me, this technology issue is not very different to the climate question, and I think thinking about solutions to this problem that involve international transfers, I think might be an important area for kind of global south countries to address. I have a lot more to say on the papers, but I think I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thanks, Imran. We have missed you a lot at this conference. Gayatri, please come in.
Yes, I'll also try and just shorten my comments in the interest of time. Thank you to ISLE and SCIS for this very kind invitation, and to be able to actually listen to these wonderful papers. My comments are just sort of briefly around I think some of the insights that we can get from the range of these kind of papers around the future of work, particularly grounding it in the context of the global south, where we already see sort of an entrenchment of informality. So to think about what does the entry of new kinds of technology, particularly digitally mediated forms of work, and what does that really entail, I think requires us to, of course, consider new ways in which informality gets entrenched, new ways in which precarity gets manifested. And I think Dr. Umar's paper really brought that out very well for us. But to also think about how old hierarchies are getting reiterated and manifested through this. So of course, she highlighted questions of gender, and we can think about the way in which caste as well sort of features very centrally in these new forms of work that sort of emerge, so that we are simply looking at new terrains of informality, but with the digital sort of mediation producing new kinds of effects there. It also then draws this question of what are really these kinds of jobs that are emerging in the global south itself. And I think the interesting sort of divide between where platforms, for instance, are located, or where capital is sort of flowing from and to, highlights the nature of these kinds of jobs, really, right? And the question of skills then become particularly important. And so it may not be the traditional mismatch as we imagine, but we're really looking at again, as we saw through the different kinds of papers, a sort of refocusing on, the state itself kind of thinking about new kinds of skills that might be needed, whether or not they actually are. And also new ways in which, different kinds of poor forms of work get reinforced within these new forms of digital work. In my own research on gig work, for instance, we actually find that when automation is taking place, it's not really taking place in low credential jobs, but we find it happening in middle management, in gig work. So it also sort of makes us think about, what kinds of jobs are emerging? Is this kind of the form of work that's going to feed into a larger pipeline of future machine learning, automation, etc.? I mean, this is the kind of ghost work that Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri have been talking about. And then, how do we kind of situate this within the context of a development discourse, but in the South, but particularly as we can see it in India, for instance, where, development has been recast as a form of economic opportunity, where there is no longer the job seeker, and I'm drawing from Lily Irani's work here, but this idea of the job seeker really goes away to a new kind of entrepreneurial citizen sort of emerging, who must cultivate sort of enterprising self, and not seek out jobs, but seek out opportunities, through new forms of work that emerge through this kind of digital economy. And it's within this kind of discourse that we see new conversations on skills happening, new conversations on education happening, which I think Dr. Salim's paper was also trying to highlight. So in this kind of scenario, when we're thinking about really the role of the state, and the kind of policies that sort of can likely emerge from it, it kind of recasts the role of policies as well. And I'm not so sure if social protection policies are going to be sufficient to tackle the many questions that are actually spilling out. I'm so sorry, spilling out of this. So for instance, trade union activists in India who are active in the field of, gig work are talking about the need for things like algorithmic audits to actually take place, which requires an entirely sort of new configuration of knowledge from policymakers, those in legal experts, and of course, activists and scholars themselves in kind of thinking about what it would entail to create create policies and intervene in this kind of field. And finally, I was thinking that it also raises the question of, to sort of circle back to, I think, the Ruth and David's paper, to think about this from a production kind of perspective, or to make us recast the role of technology itself and kind of think of, if we can consider technology as a form of a public good and what that might then entail, for instance, again, in this new realm of work that exists. So we know that there are workers, for instance, keen to start worker cooperatives in digital economies, but with sort of, extremely aggressive patent regimes that exist around these kinds of technologies. What might that actually look like? What do those routes actually entail? And how do workers, in spite of this I think the particular nature of precarity in, when we look at this intersection of new kinds of technology and work is also a certain kind of atomization of the worker that has really taken place. And yet we see forms of solidarity emerging, we see worker collectives and resistance kind of emerging. So I think it throws up all kinds of new alternatives for us to think about when we're considering the future of work here, both from the role of the state, from the role of workers, as well as for us to think about the larger context within which this is happening, where in the global south, we've already seen an entrenchment of precarity and informality. Again, I had a lot more to say, but I think I'll just stop here in the interest of time and maybe we can hear some more questions.
Thank you, Gayatri, and thanks for to all the paper writers. One set of questions for Uma. One is from Professor Seema Singh, and which is really about how are these gender aspects emerging, both in employment as well as in earnings in gig and platform work. Why do we see the proportions of women as in the labor force being reflected, and also lower earnings for women? And the second set of questions, again, from two research scholars, Jacob and Aditya Mishra, who are seated in the other hall, which is about social security. How does one think of the new code and also social protection for gig workers? The social security question, you can actually, there is a keynote presentation on that tomorrow, and there's also a panel discussion. So maybe you can be very, very brief on that, and we can discuss it also tomorrow. But these are the two questions for you, Uma.
Thanks a lot, Ravi, and thanks a lot also Imran and Gayatri for your comments, which I found it very useful. With regard to the gender question, what we very clearly see is that what is there in the offline labor market actually gets replicated onto the online labor market. So you find the proportion of women who are actually engaged very similar across the two groups when you look at it. And the other thing that we see is there's also a gender segregation of occupations. What you see in the offline labor market, that is, you see a lot of them in professional or education services, the same as what you see in the online labor market. On the online labor market, again, you find a very high proportion of male workers in the IT sector, while women are considerably small. And with regard to earnings, irrespective of which group of workers or which sector of workers that you look in, you do find that there is a gender pay gap that exists even within the occupations between men and women. There are very few countries where you do not find it, but in general, globally, and across a number of platforms, you do find it. With regard to the Code on Social Security Bill, actually, I'm going to leave it to the panel discussion, which is going to go quite deep into it. So I think.
Thanks a lot, Uma.
Thanks a lot for this.
There are a couple of questions for Sunil. The first is from Professor Sudipto Mandal, and this says, why is it that China outstrips other countries in the use of robots, but is not a major player in patents? The second is that whether this recent stagnation that you see in the use of robots, is it cyclical or is it structural? And there's another question on robots from Professor Ihd Srivastava, who asks, can we not encourage the use of robots in dangerous jobs like, cleaning sewers and so on, where we see a large number of deaths in India on a weekly and monthly basis? And why is it, do other countries use robots in occupations like this or not?
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. Regarding Sudipto's question about why China is an important one, and as you can see that wage rates in China has been rising very fast, and Chinese production has been trying to move to other low-wage countries like, for instance, Vietnam, etc. But at the same time, China would like to retain its position as a world's factory, and so would like to continue to do all the manufacturing within China itself. And so if wage rates are rising, the only recourse to that would be to use a lot of robots. And also you can see that they are becoming a very major manufacturer of electronic and especially telecom products, mobile phones, for instance. They have already become one of the largest producer of mobile phones in the world. And regarding the, and for these reasons, and their automotive industry is also growing in terms of its scale. So for these reasons, they have become a major place where robots are used. And the fact that they are also producing a lot of patents in robotic technology. The data that I showed you is slightly dated, but if you look at the more recent data on patent families, you can see that China has become, in fact, it has already overtaken, as I'm speaking, it's already overtaken Germany, France, and Korea and Taiwan. And it has now become the number 3 in terms of the total number of patents and also patents in high technology areas. So a few years ago, we were referring to China as a copycat, simply imitating other people's technology. But from imitation, they have really moved to innovation in a big way. And they have a very big program on artificial intelligence and machine learning, which would further strengthen the robotic technology. And so they would emerge, because when China is doing something, they are also able to do that much more cheaply than Western countries. So they would emerge as a very major force to be reckoned with in the area of robotics and automation in general. So that's my response to Sudipto's question. Now, regarding the use of robots for dangerous occupations, I would say that my study was entirely confined to the manufacturing sector. I did not at all touch on service robots. Now, service robots are also rising very fast. And in fact, one of the things that has happened as a result of the pandemic is that a lot of cleaning robots have started appearing, especially in hospitals and other places. And for dangerous operations like manual scavenging and other things, robots are used. Of course, manual scavenging is only in places like India and other developing countries. It's not there in developed countries. So here they have developed. For instance, in India, there are some startups which have actually developed in robotic technology for manual scavenging. But the diffusion, I really did not have any data at all. In even the International Federation of Robotics data on service robots, we really do not have any data on the kind of things that you are referring to. So that's a black area where we don't have much data. But all that I can say is that automation in the service sector, as Uma has also said, with the rise of the platform economy, is much more than automation in the manufacturing sector. Okay.
Thank you, Sunil. There is a question by Indira, our discussant Imran also referred to this issue. I think this can be addressed to Ruth and Francis. Basically, this is about regulation of technological change by governments. What is, both the need for regulation, of course, both of you have talked about, but basically, what is the kind of regulation or control that governments can have? And should there be a technological policy which is related to that? So maybe Ruth and Francis, you can briefly address that.
Thanks for that question. I have to be honest and say we're really at the beginning of thinking this through. And to the extent that we have, it's been about how do you extend labor and social protections that are usually in the realm of those in standard employment relations to platform workers. And I think there's a couple of things we've thought about so far. So the first is that in South Africa, specifically around the national minimum wage, there was a definition of worker that extended beyond employee. And this is partially in recognition of the extent of casualization and externalization that happened beforehand. And I think this is one potential lever, is how we define actually who a worker is can shape then who we define as being eligible for some kind of protection. And this then extends also to things like social insurance and unemployment insurance funds and so on. The second, which also stems from debates around informality, sort of past debates, is this idea of extended employer responsibility that really came about in South Africa in the debates with the outsourcing, for instance, in the textile sector to home workers. And so we're also thinking about what that means and how that could tie in with labor regulation. But a caveat is that the majority of workers, for instance, and this differs also, but for instance, in Uber Eats platforms, are immigrant workers, largely undocumented. So I think we do have to be mindful that calls for regulation may mean one thing for one set of decision makers, but those may actually end up further marginalizing informal workers or informalized workers. And so what we're now working on is how do you develop, in the context of South Africa, regulatory proposals that are mindful both of questions around gender and questions around immigration and citizenship.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. This is the final question in this panel by Saravanan, who's a PhD scholar. And this, I think, although this is addressed to Uma, but maybe I would request Milen to answer this. And this is about the proliferation of digital labor in the global south. What exactly does it mean? What implications does it have for employment, given also that unemployment levels seem to be increasing?
Okay, I can try to talk about. And I think there is a dichotomy profile, because when we're thinking about the formal labor market, we can think in more stable relations. But we know that in these countries, like in Brazil, in South Africa, the unemployment rate isn't a problem. So we need thinking also about this new kind of technologies, these digital jobs that doesn't mean that because people are not in the formal labor market, they don't have ways of getting income. So depends, especially of legacy regions, for example, in Brazil, this group is very high in this group of informal labor market, especially for the female workers. So when we try to speak about labor policy, these things, we also need to put focus on formal, but also in the informal labor market to try to put all the regions, to try to develop all the regions together. I think it's more this.
Thanks, Milen. That's fine. Well, I mean, I won't take any more time or make any concluding remarks, except to thank IHD and the Southern Centre for bringing this panel to us. And the whole idea of this panel was to have a set of papers which could make us think more about the areas which need considerable and significant research, in the coming years. And so thank you all. Thanks all of you for being here, for helping us organize this panel, for participating in it. And thanks to all the participants. Before I hand it over to Priyanka.
Thank you so much, Professor Srivastava. This brings us to the end of this very enriching symposium. Thank you very much.